Hello, I'm back again, as promised, exactly 1 week later from the last time that I streamed. And I think I'm pretty sure this is where I left off last time, and I'm very nervous. But this time I'm on AO3 instead of Wattpad. So, yeah. Oh, I'll post, I have excuse me. I have another video to post tomorrow, actually, is when I will end up posting that. So, yeah, I guess let's start. I'm pretty sure this is where I left off. Akashi woke with a start that same night, his string-filled shouts having pulled him from his sleep. He'd flinched hard and sat up quickly, closing his hand over his mouth to subdue the almost hysteric sounds that came from him. His breathing was heavy, his heart rate quicker than usual. Akashi could feel his heart pounding in his chest, making it difficult to swallow. Shit. That had been the fifth time that month, where Akashi had to tear himself out of another nightmare. They made him feel nauseous to a point where he had to sit up in bed and swallow deep, slow breaths in order to cool himself down, and he did just that, reaching his hands up to rub at his eyes before taking a tense look around his room. Exhaling heavily, Akashi turned around to look at the desk near his bed. His phone was there. Hesitating for only a second, he reached his hand out and took the device in his hand. When the screen lit up, a text message from Pt.2 waited there for him. "Sleep well, Akashi. It had been sent 2 hours ago." Akashi swiped and unlocked his phone with trembling hands. From Akashi, sent at 2:47 a.m. "Are you there?" Pt.2. "Yeah? Akashi? I thought you fell asleep." Akashi had to wait almost a minute for Pt.2's response. That had been the longest minute he'd ever been forced to sit through. I changed that, and I don't know why. But, hey. I woke up. Nightmares. Nightmare? You had a nightmare? Was it bad? Well, it managed to wake me up. The quiet kind of wake up? No, more like the cliched kind, where you sit up in bed in a cold sweat. Are you calming down? Are you feeling better? Akashi stared at the text message and let out a shaking sigh. Judging by his trembling hands, he knew he wasn't. Yeah, I'm just a little shaken. I don't believe you on that yeah part. I'm fine. Alright, well, we'll see about that. Furrowing his brow, Akashi stared at his phone screen and lay his head down sideways. It wasn't like Bokuto had to question what he had said in such a straightforward fashion. There was nothing to see. He pressed send and watched the phone carefully, waiting for small ellipses to appear on the lower left side of the screen. But instead he was greeted with nothing. He didn't get a response, nor did he see any signs of responding. Akashi frowned and left his phone screen alone to dim and blacken. He held it in his shaking hands and closing his eyes in an attempt to try and find sleep again. It was difficult, however, as each time he tried to drift off to sleep that unnerving fear of having the same dream would jerk him back awake. Akashi groaned softly and covered his face. Akashi's phone vibrated against his forehead. He flinched and pulled his hand away to stare at the screen. Look outside! What? Akashi kicked his legs out of bed and strode to his window. Impossible. He pulled apart the blinds and looked down. Out in the dead of night stood Bokuto, with the burgundy knit scarf around his neck, a jacket, jeans, and slippers. He looked up and grinned, and waved wildly in Akashi's direction. Akashi's eyes widened. No, 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 no. He pulled away from the windowsill and ran out of his room, straight downstairs into the front door. He threw it open and faced Bokuto, who was jogging to him with a smile and a shiver in each step. May I come in? No, why not? We're going back to the hospital right now. I'm taking you back. Akashi reached out his arms and pushed Bokuto away. What? No! Bokuto refused to budge. He pushed Akashi back this time. I just came from there. Exactly, because you belong there. Akashi felt that his words were a bit bitter, but he had no other way of telling Bokuto the truth. You're sick and you need medical attention. So I can't sleep. Bokuto swatted Akashi's hands away. What's the big deal? I'm gonna add that as a trigger warning. It's more than that. He exerted more force into his arms, but getting Bokuto to take a step back. You've had 2 panic attacks this week already, and your hallucinations are getting worse. My home is not a place for you to be right now. I get panic attacks when you're not around, Bokuto answered simple-mindedly, and my hallucinations aren't all that bad. Akashi clenched his jaw behind a mildly irritated face. Stop trying to act like this isn't such a big deal. You may not think it is, but He paused and reached out his arm to get another shove. Let's just go. I don't want to. Bokuto grabs Akashi's hands as his own. Bokuto, stop. I don't want to go back. How did you even sneak out? By sneaking out? They don't pay much attention to me anyways. Akashi yanked his hands away and stared at Bokuto. As much as it infuriated him, he knew that Bokuto wasn't going anywhere unless he let him inside his home first. He swallowed thickly. Get inside. It scared me as it's scrolling on the other screen. Bokuto's eyes did the familiar light up thing as he bounded into Akashi's home. He removed his slippers and waited at the entrance for his friend to enter. Akashi stepped in and shut the door behind him. You chose the perfect night, Akashi said bitterly as he hopped up the stairs. My parents aren't home. It's not like I would have made any noise, Akashi all but shouted, following after him. Akashi sighed. Oh wait, Bokuto shouted that, I'm sorry. Akashi sighed. I'll get you back to the hospital by 7 in the morning. Fine by me. Imagine the looks on their faces when they see me coming in from the outside. Imagine their faces when they notice I'm not even in my room. Bokuto was elated. Akashi entered his room and shut the door behind Bokuto. I'm going straight to sleep. But I thought you had that nightmare. Bokuto stood at the side of Akashi's bed. I did. He paused for a moment. Is that why you came here? Because of the nightmare? Bokuto stared at Akashi. 'Cause you said you were okay, and I knew you weren't. Akashi was at a loss for words. He returned Bokuto's gaze and looked down quickly afterwards. A hand tugged at his shirt weakly. Who is that saying? I see. I think that's Akashi. Taking a seat on the edge of the bed, Bokuto rubbed the back of his neck. What was that dream about? Akashi sat in bed and wrapped a red sheet around himself. He tossed the navy blue one to Bokuto, remembering how fond he was of it the last time he'd come over. He watched as Bokuto gathered it up in his arms and threw it around himself. He then stared at Akashi, waiting for his response. He sighed. I was drowning. His hands picked at the small little lint rolls that stuck to his sheet. Alright. I don't know what to put for that because I don't know if it's there, but whatever. His hands picked at the small lint rolls that stuck to his sheet, drowning in something black, sort of like a tar. I was fighting and trying to get out, but I had no power over it whatsoever. I was so weak it had gotten to the point where I could barely breathe. My face was the only thing sticking out. Akashi cocked his head to demonstrate this, with his finger tapping his chin. I was struggling, but in the end I couldn't move. I was shouting, but no sound came out. No one could hear me, and no one was around. Akashi shrugged. The liquid started flooding into my mouth and nose, and it wasn't until I was suffocating that I forced myself awake. Akashi didn't say another word afterwards. He only bundled himself up in the sheets that surrounded him. He turned his head to look out the window, eyeing the moon timidly. Shifting in his seat, Bokuto pulled him closer to Akashi, one hand grasping the blanket that had been given to him. Akashi remained in place, with the thought in mind that Bokuto would respect his personal space and sit a foot or two away from him, but to his apparent surprise, Bokuto leaned his head on Akashi's shoulder and slipped an arm around him. So cute! Akashi, squirming in discomfort. Oh wait, no. Akashi squirmed in discomfort. What are you doing? Comforting? Bokuto replied, lifting his head. Isn't that what humans do? Akashi watched him carefully. Don't talk like you're not one. Bokuto chortled quietly and placed his head back on Akashi's shoulder. They didn't speak for a moment, and the room was filled with hushed sounds of the outside. Hey. What? Let's watch Cloud Atlas. No. Akashi shook his head. Bokuto grumbled to himself. Why not? Don't you have it on your laptop? I do, but I don't want to watch it. It's a long movie, and I've seen it about 7 times already. Well, if you've watched it 7 times, then why not watch it in 8 times? Because it's 3 in the morning and I want to fit some sleep into my schedule. By the time that movie ends, it'll be 6, and then I'll have to walk you to the hospital before doctors find out you're missing and lose your minds. A laugh escaped Buckto, and a sound curling his lips into a smile. And what if they've already found out? Then that would be a problem. And then they turned my room upside down in an attempt to find me. That'd be a tough mess to clean up. Turning his head, Buckto looked at Akashi. Everything you say is so straightforward. Why is that? I don't know. Akashi inhaled slowly. It's just how I am. Sometimes I think I'm funny, but people never laugh at my jokes. Buckto snorted. When have you ever tried to make a joke? When I thought that it'd be a tough mess for them to clean up. Akashi sounded genuinely confused. Didn't that come off as remotely funny? Buckto couldn't help but guffaw, his head tilting back. That was your idea of a joke? You're too loud. Be quiet. Akashi shoved his visitor lightly. Despite this, it only seemed to make Buckto laugh even harder. Akashi pursed his lips in frustration, but this look quickly vanished as a small laugh fell from his lips. Well, you're laughing now. He tried to hide his smile, so I guess I am pretty good at being funny. Buckto glanced at him. Yeah, but for all the wrong reasons. His laughter died down with Akashi's. You know, I don't think I've ever heard you laugh, or seen you smile for that matter. Shrugging one shoulder, Akashi grabbed his phone. Well, now you have. Buckto looked over at the phone screen. What are you doing? Setting an alarm for 6 a.m. Akashi set his phone down and leaned back slowly, resting his head against the back of his pillow. Buckto followed, his arm still around him. This is strange. He stared up at the ceiling. Why do I let him do this? Akashi's head slumped to the side in Buckto's direction. I hope you don't mind me sleeping. He whispered the words. Of course I don't. I showed up to your house unannounced at 3 in the morning. You've got the right to sleep. I just hope it isn't rude. It isn't. Buckto's arm unconsciously squeezed Akashi's closer to his side. Oh, that's so sweet. Alright. He closed his eyes. Good night. Akashi pulled his arms in close, wrapping the sheets around himself. See you in 3 hours. It's too cute. Complete and utter silence befell them afterwards. Akashi had kept his eyes closed for quite a while, trying to fall into a deep sleep, but he found that he couldn't, or at least not as quickly as he thought he could. He kept his breathing controlled and steady for about 40 minutes. He looked sound asleep, but was actually drifting between the real world and the dream world. There was silence, and then there was a sound. A subtle, gentle sound. The sound of someone cautiously moving their arm when they didn't wish to wake someone. Akashi remained in his faux sleeping position, feeling that it would take much more of an effort for him to open his eyes and check around than to stay dormant, so he continued to try and grasp sleep, expecting nothing from the noise. It was because of this that he was so surprised when he felt a gentle sensation in his forehead. It took all of his power not to flinch when he'd felt the unfamiliar touch. There were fingers, hesitant fingers that ghosted over Akashi's forehead in order to push a loose strand of hair away. Keeping his eyes closed, Akashi took in the feeling of this. He could sense the heavy amount of reluctance in each movement that Buckto's hand had carried out. Buckto was afraid to wake Akashi, so much so that his hands trembled slightly whenever he'd push Akashi's bangs away. Slowly but gradually, Akashi's heart rate picked up. His hands twitched once and he moved closer, leaning into Buckto's touch. This backfired, however, as the other's hand quickly withdrew. Akashi relaxed then, keeping the sleeping act alive. Buckto did not move a muscle after having seen Akashi stir. The last thing he wanted to do was to wake him up, so they lay in silence for minutes on end. Akashi figured that Buckto would keep to himself for the rest of the night, so he put his focus back into trying to sleep. He held the same position and found himself dozing off. I'm sorry. The words were barely a whisper, and they came without warning. It sounded as if Buckto were talking to himself. Akashi remained still and silent. I never meant to drag you into my life. Buckto inhaled all that he could. Akashi felt his chest rise. He could practically hear the frown in his voice. I know that I'm unbearable, and I know that I'm a lost cause, and I know you know that too, and yet you still stick by me. He paused for a moment, then spoke up again. His voice was a soft tremor. So, thank you. Buckto had nothing more to say after that. He lay his cheek on top of Akashi's head and kept still, daring not to wake him, but Akashi now couldn't find it in himself to sleep. Buckto's words haunted him, and they repeated themselves over and over in his mind. He swallowed once, hoping to get rid of the lump in his chest. His throat, I mean. After that night, things had only gone downhill from then. Oh no! Akashi took a glance out the window, only to instantly throw on his clothes and toss his bag over his shoulders. He jogged downstairs, slipped his shoes on, and was out the door in seconds, making his way down the familiar route to the hospital. Above, the clouds were dense, and they gathered quickly, casting a dark shroud over Akashi's path. He zipped up his jacket to shield himself from the harsh winds that came his way, and advanced forward. There was definitely a storm coming his way, so Akashi knew that Bokuto would need him. A month and 16 days had passed since Bokuto's final visit to Akashi's home. Oh, the use of the word final. That's gonna make me cry. Okay. Well, if that's gonna make me cry, things are gonna get a lot worse, aren't they? Or so I've heard. Where was I? And once he'd been taken back to the hospital, the doctors and nurses made sure to keep a closer eye on him, and with good reason. Not only was Bokuto the kind of guy to sneak out when no one was watching, but his condition had quickly begun to worsen without warning. Before then, he would normally lose several pounds a week, but ever since the night he'd snuck out, his weight loss could only be described as alarming. In the span of little over a month, Bokuto had gone from a general 150 pounds to a mere 90. Oh no! Okay, to mere 97 pounds last time they weighed him. The drastic weight loss was awful enough, but as if to add insult to injury, Bokuto's worsening condition made it increasingly difficult for him to walk, move, and speak. Akashi frowned heavily as he entered the hospital. He made his way up the same path, walking swiftly without pause. That wasn't until he saw a familiar face. Kuru? Akashi stopped in his tracks, in front of Bokuto's room. The black-haired male looked up from his hands and faked a smile. Hey, Akashi, right? Long time. Yeah, He turned his head. Is someone in there? He didn't wait for Kuru to respond and glanced into Bokuto's room. Surely enough, he noticed Kenma sitting in the seat next to Bokuto's bed. His back was facing the door, and Bokuto seemed to have all of his attention on him. Will Kenma allow me to enter the room? Kuru rubbed the lower part of his face with his hand. Nope. He leaned back in his chair. Take a seat. Kenma usually isn't the kind of person to speak to people one-on-one, so I think you'd better leave them both alone. Inhaling deeply, Akashi lingered in place, then sat down in the empty seat next to Kuru. You seem a bit anxious. Kuru looked at Akashi sideways. I am. There's a storm coming, and Bokuto doesn't do well with those. Ah. Kuru looked at the ceiling, as if he would be able to see the clouds from there. I hadn't noticed one was rolling in. He slowly lowered his head and folded his arms. Didn't think you knew that about him. Akashi turned his head to face Kuru. Was he ever fond of him? I don't think so. In the past, he'd always get sort of tense and paranoid when a storm would pass overhead, but no, that was kind of it. Now I bet he suffers. I should have added that earlier. Now he suffers panic attacks because of him. Akashi looked down. He does. Storm struck arm. Kuru made a grunting noise and had nothing more to say on the subject. Akashi figured he should stay quiet too. He knit his fingers together and kept his eyes down, anticipating when the first boom of thunder would sound. He would have to close Bokuto's blinds and take his mind off of it somehow. Show him a movie or play a game with him that would result in him to calm down quickly. Akashi rubbed the back of his neck hastily and closed his eyes. 97 fucking pounds. Startled, Akashi opened his eyes and glanced in Kuru's direction. He glowered at nothing in particular. I'm sorry? 97 pounds, right? That's how much he supposedly weighs now? Once Akashi had realized what Kuru was talking about, he instantly felt his spirits fall. Yes. Fucking bullshit. He swore without a falter. Wincing, Akashi turned his head away. He'd only spoken to Kuru once before, and they barely exchanged any words. He didn't know how to deal with him now, so he remained silently. Silently? That's not what it says, so he remained silent. He twisted his fingers and pursed his lips, worried of what Kuru would say next. All of this is just so... Why the hell did this have to happen to him? At such an early damn age, too? He hissed the words under his breath, openly frustrated with the situation. He turned 20 only 3 months ago. Akashi lowered his head. It's not fair. It's not. Kuro echoed the words in agreement, but here we are, and here he is. Kuro rubbed his elbow, irate and sighed in defeat. I'm not coming back to visit him anymore. Not after this. I've seen enough. He turned to look at Akashi. Keep him company from now on. I don't know how you do it, but when you're around him, you help him forget. Akashi kept his eyes down. He wouldn't show this, but Kuru's word had hit him harder than he could ever imagine. They just sat heavily in the pit of his stomach, churning and pestering him, urging him to throw up. I don't know if there's any of this, but it's mentioned, so I added a warning. But he only swallowed and kept his composure, just as he'd been doing since the day he met Bokuto. Akashi reached his hand up to rub the back of his neck roughly, administering a feeling of discomfort in one area to ignore the pain that threatened to swell his heart. He closed his eyes in a slow blink and kept his breathing quiet. Having been neck-deep in his own sorrows, Kuro was blind with Kashi's. He'd forced himself to stand up after some time, tapping his fingers on his pants. Keep what you're doing. His voice was low. Akashi nodded in response. Of course, I couldn't stop, even if I tried. A biting chuckle escaped Kuro. Yeah, and that the horror of it all. He rubbed his chin and stalked his way down the hall. Keep in touch, Akashi. Of course. He repeated the same phrase, finding that it was difficult to search for the words at the time. He watched as Kuro walked away, far enough for small details to become blurred. He looked like a tall, thin black mass now, as he stood near the stairway. He was waiting for Kemma, but Akashi wondered why he hadn't wait for them in the seat he was initially sitting in. Just then, as Akashi bit down on the insides of his lower lip, he turned his head to catch a glimpse of Kemma lowering his head toward Bokuto. It wasn't necessarily a bow. It seemed more along the lines of an act of affection, or at least as affectionate as Kemma could get, which wasn't much. He touched his forehead to Bokuto's shoulder, which only earned a laugh from him. Bokuto talked quietly in response to Kemma, gave a nod and smiled. He never seemed to quit smiling. Once he saw this, Kemma picked himself up from his seat and put his hands at his side and bowed his head. He didn't last another second in Bokuto's company before he turned and briskly walked out the room. He kept his head low and played the fool, pretending he didn't see Akashi. In seconds, Ken was down the hall making his way down the stairs, having completely ignored Kuro as well. Kuro didn't seem surprised in the slightest. He only waved goodbye and at a staring Akashi before following his small friend down the stairs. I still can't believe that Kuro did that. I know this is not canon. This isn't canon at all. He wouldn't have ever done that, but my God. Hesitantly, Akashi barely managed to wave back before he heard his name being called from the all-too-familiar room by that all-too-familiar voice. He directed his attention to a grinning Bokuto who sat eagerly up in bed. Akashi almost smiled back, and he would have too if he hadn't been for the thunder that sounded its arrival from above. He watched as Bokuto's smile faded instantly, his eyes having gone from half-lidded to wide in a second. His hands squeezed tightly around the navy-blue blanket that enveloped him. Akashi, I know. He walked ahead quickly, straight into the room. He pushed the chair away and found Bokuto's side in bed. Frail, shaking fingers pushed through his own black and white hair with an attempt to calm himself down, but another thunderclap sounded louder that time. Bokuto flinched loud enough to make the bed shake. His voice broke in terror. Look at me, it's going to be fine. Akashi spoke in a calm, slow voice. His hand took Bokuto's own, and he held it gently. It was cold, and shook in short bursts. You will get through this, you always do. Staring down right at the floor of the hospital room, Bokuto fought to find words. Akashi, I don't know if that's how people stutter. I'm sorry if that's rude. Bokuto struggled with his reading. Don't what? Don't leave me. I won't leave you. He moved closer, his other hand taking hold of Bokuto's. Just breathe with me. Bokuto nodded frantically and forced himself to comply with Akashi, as he always did. He was the only person who could get them through those horrible moments after all. Heavy raindrops pelted against the window as Bokuto's frantic sounds filled the room. Akashi was glad to have made it in time. That had been one of Bokuto's worst attacks yet. Hey, Akashi? When do you think it'll snow? I don't know. Snow falls at random. Yeah, but do you think it'll snow soon? Or maybe January? I hope so. That'd be nice. Tokyo needs a little more snow now and then. Yeah. When it falls, I want to go out and stand in it. So, kind of funny, which is very off topic of what's happening right now, but we woke up today, where I'm at, we woke up with a foot of snow, and it snowed like all day, even though it's mid-February. We had lots of snow, so I just thought that was pretty cool. That was after not having any snow last year, like at all. Akashi sat cross-legged in the seat adjacent to Bokuto's bed. He looked up at the sickly when he said those words, trying to meet his gaze, but ultimately finding no yellow eyes to look into. Bokuto had his head turned away. He was staring outside at the white clouds that shrouded the skies, mesmerized by just how colorless it made everything seem. It was one of those white days, as Bokuto liked to call them, so he paid much more attention to the world beyond the glass than he did to his own confined life in the hospital. Bokuto breathed in deeply, the sound filling the small space around them. The bedsheets crumpled beneath his hands. Are you sure you should be going out in the cold like that? I think I can handle it. Akashi didn't want to bring up the fact that Bokuto would probably no longer possess the ability to walk by the time any snow did get a chance to fall, so he kept his mouth shut. He rubbed his hands together weakly and tilted his head to the side. I guess you can, just as long as you're feeling better. Bokuto scoffed. It was a quiet sound. I am. Stop asking already. That was 6 days ago. I know, but it was bad. It passed. Bokuto turned his head, the pillow crumpling under his neck. He looked at Akashi with heavy-lidded eyes. He was extremely pale and somehow thinner than before, but he kept that same smile on his face. I'm fine now. Akashi couldn't help but smile back at him. He leaned his chin against the palm of his hand and chortled. Or at least you as fine as you can get. Bokuto stared at Akashi sharply. His lips quivered before he could form his words. Shut up. A stronger laugh broke out from him, rattling his body as he laid down in bed. I look like shit, I know. Akashi found himself laughing along with him. His quiet chuckle was louder than Bokuto's wholehearted laugh. You don't look like shit. He tried to hide his grin with his hand, but it was still visible with the gaps between his fingers. Bokuto reached a hand out, aimlessly trying to swat Akashi's own hand away. He tried to aim for it at the very least, but found it difficult to... Still, he continued. Don't cover that. Cover what? Your smile. Why? It isn't anything special. I barely ever see it. Bokuto's fingers touched Akashi's knuckles. That was enough for Akashi to remove his hand in front of his mouth, slowly, moving it to rest over his chin. He smiled down at him. Bokuto's eyes stared forward in an engrossed gaze, his yellow hues taking a mental picture of what he would probably never see again. Many words dashed through his mind, but he could only think of 3 that would be the best for him to say to Akashi. He tried to open his mouth to say them, but he performed another action instead. Unconsciously, his hand grasped Akashi's own, and he dragged it down with his lack of strength, causing them both to startle. Akashi's eyes widened. I thought you would hold it up. That was sudden. Akashi stifled a laugh. It caught me off guard. I didn't mean to. It's all right. He smoothed his thumb over Bokuto's necklace. I'm holding it now. Silently and almost in fascination, Bokuto stared at Akashi once again, longer this time before he looked up, then down, then away. He turned his head towards the window, away from Akashi. He couldn't face him. So I'm gonna I'm gonna go get some water. This is a roller coaster, and I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm gonna go get some water. Alright, we're back to believing in hydration. Anyways. Pursing his lips timidly, Akashi ceased to speak. He studied the back of Bokuto's head, eyeing the messy strands of black and white hair that overlapped each other. His green eyes then fell to study his paling skin. His veins were easily noticeable now, and they bulged from beneath his flesh whenever he moved. Akashi's eyes lowered, focusing on the one arm that was attached to the hand he was holding. He studied the small needle that was lodged into Bokuto's forearm, and eyed the thin tube. I'm gonna mark that. What's it called? Eyed the thin tube that was attached to this, and followed it up to the bag of IV fluid that hung above his head. Whatever was left of Akashi's smile faded. Ever since Bokuto's last panic attack, it had suddenly become more difficult for him to control his words, movements, and actions altogether. Such a task as easy as swallowing was now a problem for Pt.2. After many failed attempts at keeping his food down or getting it to go down in the first place, the nurses found it would be best if Pt. received nourishment the only other way possible, and that was through a tube. Over the span of 6 days, Akashi found that the only things Pt. could manage to swallow were small snacks like grapes, ice cubes, and Pocky Sticks that were specifically strawberry-flavored. Other than those things, Pt. found it nearly impossible to stomach anything else. His only other choice was to lie there and accept whatever it was the IV liquid had to offer him. Looking back at Bokuto, he was relieved to see that he still had his attention to the window. At some time while Akashi was spacing out, the blue blanket that surrounded Bokuto had been pulled up to just below his chin, with only his arm hanging out to hold Akashi's hand. Bokuto's breathing was quiet, and his hand never really remained still for a long time. It would shake ever so often, and each time it did, Akashi would squeeze lightly in response. This was their unspoken communication. This was Akashi's way of letting Bokuto know that everything would be alright, and this would always comfort him, no matter the situation they were in. They both found it easier to believe in that lie than accept the truth of what was to come. So, from what I've heard on people talking about this, I'm gonna cry. And seeing as how I won't even cry in front of my family, this is gonna be fun. On the numbingly cold day that was January 3rd at 8:04 p.m., the snow had fallen for the first time that year. Bokuto was the first to notice this, but had been the last to say anything about it. It wasn't until Akashi looked up from his laptop screen and that he realized it was snowing heavily outside. His eyes lit up, intent on informing Bokuto, but when he turned his head to look at him, instead of being greeted by an overly enthusiastic friend, he was presented with an unfazed expression upon Bokuto's weary face. Akashi frowned. Bokuto, don't you see it? Looking up from the laptop screen. 1 second. Looking up from the laptop screen, Bokuto directed his attention to Akashi. Oh, the snow. It's snowing outside? Bokuto turned his head to catch another look out the window. Surely enough, snow was falling, and in chunks too, but this didn't grasp Bokuto's attention. Frankly speaking, it had no effect on him in the slightest. He managed a feeble shrug and turned to continue on with the movie that he'd watched for the 13th time already. Akashi was genuinely confused. I thought you were waiting for the snow. I thought that's what you said you wanted. His eyelids drooping and then snapping open again, Bokuto made a small sound. I see. Fine. Just then, Akashi's lips parted in realization. Bokuto's hallucinations had become such a part of him that he thought the snow outside was just another mind trick. He breathed in sharply. It's not a hallucination, Bokuto. It's actually snowing. Bokuto looked up to stare at the window again. There was a longing in his eyes that Akashi couldn't stand to see. With barely an ounce of strength left, Bokuto pulled himself up to get a tad better look outside. Curiosity had sparked within him. He wanted to know if it was real or not. He hated how difficult it had been for him to tell apart the real things from the fake ones. I'll show you. Akashi stood from his seat and walked to the windowsill. There he parted the glass slightly. A gust of icy wind charged its way into the room in an instant, draining the warmth from everything it touched. Bokuto's skin crawled, goosebumps pimpling his porcelain surface. He pulled the thick blanket over himself with much effort. Swiftly, Akashi closed the window, having gathered just enough snow off the edge for him to show Bokuto. He strode to him quickly, cupping the already melting snow in his hands. Bokuto held his own, eager to see if it was true. See, look. Bokuto placed a small, compressed lump of snow into Bokuto's palm. This learned a gasp from him. Bokuto stared down at the white clump of melting ice, and with one finger he pressed against it to watch it all fall apart. The tiny snowflakes deteriorated in the warmth of his palm, leaving a small puddle behind. A gasp escaped Bokuto. His eyes widened as much as they could. Akashi! I know. Take me outside. It's freezing. Akashi murmured the words and looked Bokuto up and down. That he was nothing more than a blanket with a head. You tremble when it's 70 degrees in the room. Right now it's about 10 degrees outside. Please, Akashi. Pressing his lips into a thin slab of a line, Akashi shook his head once more. He found it much too difficult to say no to Bokuto, but it had to be done. I can't. But why? Bokuto's spirits fell, his frown deep. The weather will only hurt you, and you need to be protected. From what? Bokuto stared at Akashi, his features having gone from disappointed to unaccepting. Akashi drew in a breath, but found he couldn't say anything. He watched Bokuto with a weary gaze, unaware of what he was to say next. I'm already in death row. I can barely speak. I can barely walk. I can't eat. I can't sleep. The last thing he clenched his jaw, frustrated with himself and the words he spoke. You need to do is worry about me catching a cold. Bokuto. Cold or not, I'm still not going to last very long. So please, Let me have this. His eyes were glued to Akashi's, and Akashi found that he was unable to look away. Bokuto's eyes had said everything to him. He translated all that his words could not. Akashi looked down and away from Bokuto, then back to the window. I think the window will be as far as we can go, he said in a hushed voice. That's fine with me. And just like that, a smile found Bokuto's face again. Akashi sighed to himself, frustrated with how easily he'd given in to Bokuto's begging, but as he thought of it, he figured he couldn't be blamed for it. He didn't want to be the one to say no to someone who had little to nothing left in his life. There was that, and the fact that Akashi couldn't help but find Bokuto's smile endearing, no matter how sickly he looked when he wore one. It's wholesome. Come on. Come on. Akashi reached a hand out to help Bokuto to his feet. He urged him to keep the blanket around him, but Bokuto insisted that he leave it behind. He held onto the AV stand with one hand and Akashi's hand in his other as he hobbled over to the window. Bokuto's hands were as cold as ice, causing Akashi's concern to grow in him even more. But no matter how much he worried for him, Akashi continued their way to the window at a slow and steady pace until he finally made it. Once there, Bokuto pulled his hand from Akashi's and leaned against the windowsill. The air was bitter and cold, and it hit Bokuto like a slap to the face as another gust of wind forced its way into the hospital room. This did not faze him, however, as Bokuto only closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, allowing the burn of the winter air to fill his lungs. When he exhaled, a puff of smoke left him. Bokuto stuck his head out of the window slightly and kept it there as snowflakes fell all around him. Don't do that. Akashi pulled Bokuto back inside. He expected to hear a whine of resistance from him, but instead received nothing. Bokuto only complied and stuck his entire arm out instead, watching as each individual snowflake passed around his limb, as if none wanted to touch him. On occasion, one or two would land on him, and he would draw his hand in quickly to see if he could make out the small pattern on them. He would study them for quite a while until they melted, and left behind nothing more than a droplet on his arm. After this, he would repeat the same process, paying little to no mind to the freezing cold that surrounded him. Kakashi watched Bokuto, mesmerized by his actions. He almost portrayed the behaviors of a child, sticking to an activity and refusing to let it up, repeating whatever he was up to without having anyone tell him to stop. Akashi furrowed his brow and looked outside, away from Bokuto. That familiar feeling of dread was rising up within him, something Akashi wanted to forget. He placed one hand on the windowsill and squeezed, his knuckles going white. They shared another moment of silence, something that occurred more often than Akashi would have liked. Seeing Bokuto's speaking skills weren't as good as they used to be, he was still the more talkative one of the two, so whenever he went silent, an unwelcome feeling of discomfort fell its home within Akashi. He wanted to rid himself of this feeling, rid himself of this silence. So he searched his mind in haste for a new word that came to mind. He needed something, anything, to say to Bokuto, just so that he could liberate himself from the horrid feeling that threatened to overtake him. You know, I never asked, Akashi managed to say, staring out into the distance. Why are you so fond of the snow, Bokuto? He waited for an answer, but did not receive one. Unnerved, he spoke up again. I mean, in your state now, it's a bit cliched, don't you think? It was his attempt of brightening the mood, or being funny, as some called it, but alas, his words had fallen flat on the ground as he received another silent reply from Bokuto. Akashi frowned deeply. He turned his head to get a clear look at Bokuto's face, but instantly wished he hadn't. In his silence, Bokuto wept to himself, fat tears rolling down his cheeks. Fat tears rolling down his cheeks in numbers. The hand that supported his weight against the windowsill trembled without pause, and another rain remained outside, shaking in the cold dead of night. Several flakes had gathered on the outstretched limb, but they were not quick to melt. They settled there, deeming Bokuto one of them for the remainder of their frozen lives before they eventually melted or fell away. Akashi stared at Bokuto, opened his mouth to say something, but found that he couldn't even form one simple word. Realizing this, Akashi decided to take action and reached out to comfort him, but he couldn't even do this. His arms and legs were stiff, as were his eyes. All he could do was stare at the melancholic performance that played out before him. I thought that I was gonna have to add the dreaded warning in this reading. But maybe it'll be the next one, hopefully. Not this one. Do something. Akashi closed his mouth and swallowed. Do something. Anything. Akashi's body didn't respond. He could only watch those tears as his tears fell at a faster pace, down into his hospital gown and onto the floor. The light that came from outside reflected off of Bokuto's teardrops, lighting up his face in the most general of ways. Eventually, Bokuto drew back his hand and let it fall to his side. He hung his head and tried to keep his crying controlled in the best way possible, but this proved to be very difficult as sobs broke out of him, causing his entire body to shake. After a moment of trying to gather himself, Bokuto choked out 2 simple words with quivering lips. Why me? Akashi stared on as his mind searched for words. He found some and said them without a second thought. Because life is unfair. Bokuto reached up a cold, frail hand to wipe the mess out of his face. I wanted to do so many things. I know. Akashi balled his hand into a fist, mentally scolding himself for the present lack of emotion in his voice. As Bokuto backed away from the window, Akashi was quick to close it, locking in the bitter night air from out of the room for the remainder of the night. He then reached out and took hold of Bokuto's arm to help him back to bed. Once they had reached it, Bokuto resumed his usual position and wrapped the thick blanket around himself, then turned away from Akashi. He watched the window quietly, paying no mind to his visitor, or so Akashi thought. In a matter of minutes, just as Akashi had started to fidget, Bokuto spoke up. Akashi? Yes? Excuse me. I'm just gonna take a drink of water, calm down, take a deep breath. Okay. We're good now. I shouldn't stutter as much. Yes? His undivided attention was on Bokuto. He hesitated for a moment, but finally spoke up. I don't want you to visit me anymore. Akashi's eyes squinted at the words, and he leaned forward in shock. What? Please, don't visit me anymore. No. Akashi stood from his seat. Please, no, it's a little too late for that, Bokuto. A shiver racked Akashi, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to stand. Akashi, please. No was my final answer. He stalked over the other side of the bed where he'd be able to look at Bokuto's face. Once Bokuto noticed this, he turned his head and slowly rolled away. Akashi's eyes widened, his emotions now falling victim to a strange mix of fear and fury. Bokuto, what is the meaning of this? Bokuto didn't respond. He remained in the same position and only moved his hand to wipe at his face again. Answer me. Sucking his teeth, Bokuto pulled the blanket up just beneath his chin. It already took some time, but he finally answered. I don't want you to grow any more attached to me than you already are. Akashi nearly scoffed. What makes you think I'm attached to you? I never said that I was. This time, Bokuto directed his attention to Akashi. He wore a grimace upon his reddened face. Shut up, Akashi. He breathed in deeply, frustrated with himself and the gradual growth of his speech impediment, but he continued on. I know you hate hospitals. Don't come telling me now that you have only been coming here every day because you wanted to. Akashi had nothing else to say. He stared at Bokuto with his lips parted, as if he were going to speak, but ended up speechless. I know that you care, even if it's just a little bit. Bokuto covered his mouth and coughed suddenly. He found that speaking was taking up more energy than he thought. Still, he continued to talk. I don't know much about this disease, partly because I was too afraid to read up on it, but I know I don't have much time left. His frustration slowly faded, and all that was left upon his pale face was a look of defeat. 1, maybe 2 months at most, if I'm lucky. That's how long I know I have left. The air around Akashi thickened, and suddenly he found it difficult to breathe. Bokuto looked down and twisted his lips to the side. I heard the doctors talking. They don't know how to heal me, so... From beneath the blanket, Akashi could see Akashi's shoulders rise and fall. It's just a slow downhill ride from here, and I don't want you to see it all happen. Bokuto laid there glass-eyed, his balled-up tears glintering in the dim of the room. I don't want you to watch me decay. Small tears spilled out of Bokuto's eyes and rolled down his hauntingly placid features. So I figured if you left now, you wouldn't have to, and it wouldn't hurt so much. Once again, that crippling spell took hold of him, and Akashi couldn't move, nor could he speak. All he could do was watch in muted anguish as Bokuto finally accepted what had become his short-lived life. Excuse me. I didn't think I was gonna cry today. But apparently I was wrong. Excuse me, excuse me. Akashi realized that those smiles he had seen before were smiles of denial, forced grins that tried desperately to trick Bokuto into thinking everything would be fine. But he couldn't keep it up forever. Not in the state he was in. Bokuto had always been struggling to keep a positive front, but in the inside, he was falling apart all along, and Akashi knew this now. In an attempt to move, he tapped his fingers against his legs at an impatient pace. He was trying to do everything he could to psych himself into doing at least something to let Bokuto know he was there for them. Do something. As if he were one of the living dead, Akashi forced one leg forward, and then the next, till he was touching the bedside. He pushed his negative thoughts aside and sat down in bed, right next to Bokuto. Akashi didn't give him time to react as he moved closer Still, when he was close enough, he lowered his head to lean it up Bokuto's shoulder. Akashi squeezed his hand together to keep them from shaking uncontrollably. I'm not leaving, Kotaro. His voice was hushed, gentle. And nothing you say will make me leave. Bokuto kept silent. Not a word left him, even as he reached up a hand to wipe at his face again. He only sniffed on occasion and shifted in place, but never did he say anything to oppose Akashi's decision. He was glad. Akashi turned his head slightly, his cheek gently resting on Bokuto's shoulder. He took in slow, deep breaths and closed his eyes. And his eyebrows knit together for only a second. His hands quivered as he dug his nose into his knuckles. Bokuto no longer smelled like a hospital. Bokuto smelled like home. Excuse me. I don't know what happened. I didn't expect myself to cry like that. I guess we'll read one more chapter. The reflection of ending movie credits could be seen in Akashi's eyes as they rolled up along the screen of his laptop. Sitting back, he reached a hand out and paused the movie that had been on screen. So, how was it, watching a movie for the 1000th time? There was almost a hint of sarcasm in his voice. Lying next to Akashi, a ghostly pale Bokuto smiled. Good. Bokuto eased back and buried his head into his pillow. He looked in Akashi's direction. It took a moment for Bokuto to focus on him. Pulling his laptop close, but Akashi smoothed his finger along the mouse pad. He looked to the lower right of the corner of the screen. January 19th, 6:40 p.m. Akashi pulled a solemn face and closed the laptop. He moved in his seat and sat straight against the head of the bed and looked down at Bokuto. His tired eyes were on Akashi. He was grinning. Forcing a smile of his own, Akashi tilted his head only slightly. What are you smiling at? He reached a hand out and touched Bokuto's forehead. He was cold to the touch, colder than most. Akashi was quick to withdraw his hand, but he managed it discreetly. It took a moment for Bokuto to respond, but after some time, he managed some words. Thank you. Don't worry about it. A sheepish grin curled Akashi's lips. I know you're fond of that movie. He looked down at Bokuto as he said this and glanced away soon after. Something told him those words weren't meant for the movie, but Akashi shoved his thought away. He twisted his body to reach for the box of Pocky that sat on the counter. He opened it and pulled one out. Bokuto nodded and stretched a wobbling arm out. Akashi placed it in between his fingers, and Bokuto retracted his hand to hold the biscuit snapped against himself. He held it to his nose with some difficulty and breathed in the strawberry scent, and let his arm fall. He touched it lightly, twirled it shakily between his fingers, studied it, but he never ate it. Akashi placed the box back on the counter and huffed softly. You seem to have grown more attached to that Pocky stick than me. Bokuto looked up, surprised, and glanced down at the snack in his hands. He took some time for Akashi's words to reach him, but when they finally did, his face lit up as he broke out in laughter. It was the weakest sound Akashi had ever heard. Ah, I finally said something funny. Akashi chuckled with Bokuto, folding his arms in the process. I told you I had my moments every so often. Bokuto's laughter died down, and he closed his eyes. Really? Give me a break here. Akashi's chortling had been dragged out for a few seconds longer before he too quieted down. They remained speechless in each other's company for several minutes before Bokuto actually spoke up, his voice sounding like nothing more than a mere whisper. Keiji? Akashi looked at him. Mm-hmm. Bokuto swallowed thickly and toyed with the Pocky in his hand. Ask me why I like Cloud Atlas so much. Perplexed, Akashi directed his full attention to Bokuto. Alright, Kotaro. Why do you like Cloud Atlas so much? He watched Bokuto eat intently, curious to know what his answer would be. No. Looking up at Akashi with eager eyes, as if he'd been asked the question of his own free will, Bokuto gladly answered. So you know in the movie, when the characters died in one life? He kept his weary yellow eyes on Akashi, waiting for him to nod. Once he did, Bokuto continued. Well, I like it when they find each other again in another life. Bokuto's voice was soft, measly, and carried no force to it, but as he spoke about his favorite scene, Akashi could sense a powerful vibe coming from him. One that wasn't there before. A hopeful one. It makes me feel like I'll have another life. I'll be on this one. One that's better. Where I can actually wake up to you and be with you. A smile played on his pale, thin lips. One where we can live normal lives instead of living this one. Akashi couldn't find any words to say at that moment. He stared at Bokuto and could only nod with whatever it was he thought he was agreeing with. He felt as if all the air had been squeezed out of his body by the words Bokuto had spoken. Of all the things Bokuto found most endearing in the movie, Akashi never thought it would be that. Managing a miserable smile, Akashi roughly rubbed his palm with his thumb. You know, I would like that. Very much. He smoked gently in Bokuto's direction. Me, too. Bokuto's eyes never left Akashi. He stared at him intently and watched every move he made, to the point where this captured Akashi's attention. Why do you watch me like that? His emerald eyes met golden ones. Though the question was asked clearly, Bokuto didn't make a sound, nor did he move. He instead continued to stare at Akashi's direction with hopeful eyes. After what it felt like the longest 10 seconds of his life, a sudden shudder charged down Akashi's spine, causing goosebumps to rise on his flesh. He held his breath and proceeded to ask again. Oh. Kotaro, why do you watch me like that? It took every fiber of his being to keep his voice from trembling. It was just then that Bokuto's eyes blinked in realization, and slowly but surely, he moved his lips to answer. Just because. He replied in what almost sounded like a surprised tone. I didn't want you to leave. Sometimes, when I blink, you aren't there anymore. Bokuto rubbed one of his eyes, then the other, and let his hand drop to his side. Akashi tried to hide his frown. His eyes looked down at Bokuto's hands. They were thin and bony. You could see the smooth blue veins curling over the bones beneath his flesh. He reached out a hand and took Bokuto's hand in his own. Bokuto's automatic reaction to the warmth was to curl his fingers around Akashi's grasp. He looked at him and exhaled through his nose quietly. Akashi met his gaze, then looked down. Don't worry, I'm still here. Bokuto nodded feebly against his pillow. I'm still here too. His voice was weaker than before, if possible. Akashi nodded with it. Yeah, you're still here too. With what little strength he had left, Bokuto breathed. Akashi wished he could do the same. I'm gonna sit here and pull myself together. Hold on a second. Alright. Sorry about that. Anyways, that's gonna have to be it for today. I've been reading for about an hour now, and I guess now it's time for me to try to get some sleep. which I will sleep. I don't really have very many issues sleeping. Sorry. She has some very nice input to the situation. I'm not sure if she quite enjoys, another life, but, I mean, her words could be taken out of context to see that she does enjoy it, but for the most part, I don't think those are very happy squeaks, if you know what I mean. Anyways, thanks for watching, and, yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Sayonara. There. Sorry. Sayonara.